Um, Thanks, Philip, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. So the title of my talk presentation today is Liberty, Fear, and City of Sensations. In this talk, I examine landscape scenes of liberty and fear as described by Sir William Chambers in his dissertation on Oriental gardening, and I analyze them in relation to Edmund Burke's theory of the beautiful and sublime. I argue that Chambers' depiction of these landscape scenes was motivated by a commitment to the importance of cultivating the sentiment of fear in liberal commercial societies, as the dissertation puts forward the role of the sublime scenes for constraining limitless human will in coexistence with the landscape of liberty. A vehicle for the Burkean sublime effect, Chambers' City of Sensations was an educational site contributing to social harmony and maintaining religious sentiment. The dissertation provides an important example of how the Burkean sublime, within frameworks of spirituality and well-being, shaped discourses on city and landscape planning in the second half of the 18th century. Sir William Chambers, in his dissertation on Oriental gardening, envisioned scenes of the pleasing, the terrible, and surprising as the methods of Chinese gardening. The seemingly fictitious descriptions, however, as Elaine Harris has convincingly shown, consist of a theory of Chambers' his own. Underneath the Chinese disguise, the sensational scenes resonated strongly with the effect of the sublime and beautiful described by Burke in his philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of sublime and beautiful, which Chambers had carefully studied. Based on John Locke's idea of sensations as a foundation of human nature, Burke traced the sublime and the beautiful to fundamental emotions such as pity, fear, pride, and sympathy. Burke's anatomy of aesthetic sentiment is associated with his exploration of the classical question of how tragedy pleases, and is aimed to have consequences for the effective, moral, and religious life of the city, or to enhance providential sociability. Underpinning Burke's inquiry is natural law philosophy of Cicero and Thomas Aquinas, which essentially maintains that God rules existence through an eternal, universal natural law, always binding on all people everywhere. In the favorable climate of Scottish Enlightenment, natural law came to be associated with the principle of human emotions and influenced scholars such as David Hume and physician William Cullen's inquiries in the fields of psychology, physiology, as well as morality and politics. With a similar approach, many 18th century architects and theoreticians understood architecture as a moral psychological instrument, affecting one's mind by impressing on the senses. It's with the same approach that Chambers writes a dissertation and thinks of landscape gardening. He makes it plain in the preface to the dissertation, quote, "Gardening's dominion is general, its effects upon the human mind certain and invariable," end quote. So in this paper, I shall argue the dissertation proposes a system of sensational landscaping, exciting opposite sensations in passengers' minds. Chambers' Chinese gardening is a vehicle for Burke's sublime and the beautiful. In Chambers' vision of, quote, "the whole kingdom as a Chinese garden, where nature appears predominant," it indicated his landscaping theory that British cities and the countryside should become large-scale sites where balanced emotions are formed as if by providence, where the pleasing scenes induce pleasures, the liberty of the imagination in civil society, the scenes of the terrible and the surprising provoke fear, astonishment, and reverence, so as to maintain the citizens' religious sentiment and combine mental and physical well-being. In the preface, the Chinese gardens are contrasted to the English style of gardens, typically represented in Capability Brown's naturalistic gardening. The Brownian style of gardening, as Chambers criticizes, is not only monotonous and insipid, but also, as an act of liberty, it laid waste the growth of several ages. Chambers' image of the Brownian garden as an axe refer to the criticism of Brown's gardening often removing whole villages to achieve an aesthetic view for the landed class. This image also engaged the discourse of the liberty of the imagination that is associated with these large landscape estates in the 18th century. Joseph Addison in Spectator had famously exclaimed that the pleasure one enjoys at the English landscape farm is the freedom of sight, which makes immaterial contact with unbounded views and feels a delightful stillness and amazement in the soul. The admiration of the Addisonian sublime, as Richard Bogg discussed, is not only admiration of the greatness of nature, but it's also a delight in the limitless liberty or expansiveness of the imagination or the mind. Now, this unbounded imagination, as Chambers' characterization, is a terrifying vision of an axe, an image of the unlimited human will, or what Stephen White called false sublime. On this liberty and axe image, Chambers shows his alignment with Scottish Enlightenment thinkers such as David Hume. For Hume, liberty of the imagination is considered as the mind's innate and vigorous capacity for creating associative chains of images and ideas, as well as the dangers of its excess, the moral need to constrain such excess, and the opposition between liberty and the power of such constraint. Burke's inquiry clearly shares the same position. Beauty, Burke holds, is some quality in bodies acting mechanically upon the human mind by the intervention of the senses. In contrast, the sublime constrains or suspends this mental activity of associations. As Burke writes, the passion caused by the great and sublime in nature, where those causes operate most powerfully, is astonishment. And astonishment is that state of the soul in which all its motions are suspended with some degree of horror. In this case, the mind is so entirely filled with its object that it cannot entertain any other, or by consequence, reason on that object which employs it. Here, Burke describes the paralysis of the rational capacity by fear as an exemplary reaction to the sublime. The sublime for Burke is a question not of the subject's increasing self-awareness, but of the subject's sense of limitation and of the ultimate value of that experience within a social and ethical context. Whereas the Addisonian sublime empowers the human will to embrace limitlessness itself, the Burkean sublime encourages a sense of human limitation in the face of divine mystery. In Burke's analysis of the beautiful and sublime, the psychological powers of pleasure and pain, relaxation and contraction connect with the discourse of liberty and constraint in morality and society. In 18th century Britain, along with the undermining of traditional Christianity, there was an increasingly powerful revolutionary discourse of natural liberty. Against the popular revolutionaries' argument, Burke's idea of liberty is not a license to act from sheer self-will. For Burke, liberty derives from natural law. Liberty is that state of things in which liberty is secured by the equality of restraint. Liberty must comport with moral order. He warned, liberty is the greatest of all evils, for its folly, vice, and madness, without tuition and restraint. To be fit for freedom, people need self-control and morality. Quote, men are qualified for civil liberty in exact proportion to their disposition to put moral chains upon their own appetites. Society cannot exist unless a controlling power upon will and appetite be placed somewhere. An advisor to George III and affiliated to the so-called Tory establishment, Sir William Chambers was deeply aware of the moral political crisis mobilized by the radical Whig print culture and the city riots, of which he was also a victim. Just as Burke exclaimed that liberty without wisdom and virtue is great evil, Chambers also aired his anti-radical Whig's views. Liberty, which has so many advantages, attended with some inconveniences of a very serious nature, amongst which the ferocity of its loyalist votaries is none of the least formidable. The rigors of emperor are less frightful to me than the frolics of savage mob, elevated to madness with songs of freedom and tons of strong beer. It's easier to please a man with one good head than a monster with 10,000, all bad ones. The remedy to unbounded liberty, as Burke indicated in Inquiry, laid in the training of one's sensibilities. As Burke recognized, while its objects of the beautiful, with the associations of pleasure, love, and sympathy, can strengthen human bonds and enhance sociability, objects of the sublime, by evoking fear, can constrain the expansive imagination and maintain a balanced, healthful bodily and mental being. Following Burke's theory of sublime and beautiful, Chambers sought a landscape gardening that is capable of cultivating tempered imaginations and sensibilities. The opposition of the sentiments of pleasure and fear, corresponding to the Burkean beautiful and sublime, are clearly shown in Chambers' dissertation. Thinly disguised in the Chinese mask, the scenes of the pleasing, the terrible, and the surprising are at once a miniature of the 18th century British social life of liberty and its proposed antidotes of moral constraints. Here is an example of the many scenes of the pleasing that is described in Chambers' dissertation. This is a menagerie of the Kew Gardens, which was designed by Chambers. So along with other scenes, here it displays the pride of the British upper and middle classes in landscape improvement, technological developments, and colonial and commercial expansion. In another example, Chambers described an interesting scene which he disguised again in the Chinese mask. As he describes, the ships arrive at the port, the shops are opened, and the goods are offered to sale. The shopkeepers seize the passengers to purchase their merchandise, and every liberty is permitted. There's no distinction of persons, even the emperor is confounded in the crowd. Quarrels happen, battles ensue, the watch seizes upon the combatants. They are conveyed before the judge, who examines the dispute and condemns the culprit, who is sometimes very severely bastinadoed, to divert his imperial majesty and the ladies of his train. While these above fictional quarrels and battles may be seen as an allegory of the recent riots in British colonies and British streets, for example, protests associated with Stamp Act in 1765 and the Freeport Act in 1766. The Chinese corporeal punishment of bastinado may be seen as a judicial constraint on English liberty stretched to its full extent. But the physical pain from bastinado could also be read as anticipating the mental constraints of the sublime effect that the traveler through the Chinese gardens is soon to experience. as we are shown in the dissertation, trees torn into pieces by the violence of tempests, buildings ruined or swept away by the fury of the waters, wolves and tigers howling in the forests, gibbets, crosses, and apparatus of torture seen from the roads. These scenes, however fictitious they may sound like, testified Chambers' employment of the Burke's sublime effect. They did not result in a picture of the mind as oppressed by fear, but rather as terror in distance, which could bring delight. Physiologically, these scenes of the terrible gave the nerves powerful stimuli to regulate the release and the contraction of the fibers of the organism, and they kept the organism in a state of well-being. Emotionally and morally, the tragic scenes appearing to be providentially orchestrated evoked humbling religious responses such as sympathy, astonishment, admiration, and reverence. As Burke demonstrated, the capacity to delight in misfortune consolidated the impulse of sympathy in human beings, thereby fulfilling a larger providential purpose. On the other hand, the incredible darkness, volcano, subterranean tombs on oriental dragons represented the violent, powerful, and irresistible force which could suspend rational scrutiny, putting moral restraints on the hubris, licentiousness, and anarchy produced by the liberal, commercial, and civil society. Chambers, in the dissertation, proposed the landscaping system of sensations applied to the land of the whole country. Well, this image was shown earlier. It's a scene in Kew Gardens. So not only, Chambers' theory is not only limited in the design or plan of landscape park, but in fact, it should be, as he proposed, should be applied to the whole city and the countryside. As he asserts, by this means of landscape gardening, the whole kingdom might soon become one magnificent, vast garden. He emphasizes that the Chinese gardening, with its variety which can excite opposite sensations, should be referred to in the construction of British cities. In or near great cities, where property is much divided, on flats where nature has no play, in all tame situations, the richer and more artificial manner of our gardening is preferable, because it may contain much variety in a small compass, and corrects the natural defects of the ground more speedily, more effectually, with less charge than any other. Chambers' landscape of sensations, or what he called Chinese natural gardening, as Nicholas Pafsner rightly observes, was to be used for planning of complex aesthetic effects on the base of existing elements. We may further note that nature, in Chambers' landscape theory, may be identified with Burke's idea of natural law, the divine and the moral order corresponding to balanced human sensibilities. Thus, Chambers' praise of Chinese cities appearing like nature through landscaping indicates the moral core of his landscape theory. Thanks. That is, the British urban environment should endeavor to achieve the effect of orchestrating the basic elements of human nature, pleasure, fear, and reverence, into balance as it formed by providence. As Chambers imagined, sensational transportation networks where roads, canals, bridges, and plantations through Britain connected scenes of the pleasing and the sublime, so as to excite opposite passions in the passengers' minds when they were traveling. In the disguise of Chinese artist, Chambers ventured his suggestions. May convert a whole province into a garden, where the spectator, instead of toiling on foot as usual to see a few nothings and performing more revolutions than a horse in the mill, may wander over a whole country at his ease, in ships or barges, in carriages or on horseback, feasting the sight with scenes of the boldest dimensions, and contemplating the luxuriant varied productions of nature, improved and nobly enriched by art. In Chambers' vision, the rows, with various arrangements combined with constructions of new or uncommon objects, can produce all different kinds of effect, of greatness, of surprise, and of fear, becoming an instrument of engineering balanced nervous activities. Here are some images, not by Chambers himself, but his this is an image by Ledoux, who studied with Chambers together in France. I think this image explains what Chambers described, how roads are constructed to evoke reverential appreciation of what Burke would call the Creator's almighty arm. I'll just quickly go through this. In some places, these roads are carried by lofty vaulted passages through the rocks and the mountains, or upon causeways and bridges, over lakes, torrents, and arms of the sea. And in others, they are supported between the precipices upon chains of iron, or upon pillars, and many tiled arches over villages, pagodas, and cities. And again, this is an image by Zhuang, Chambers' student in the Royal Academy. Yeah, and another example, again, is by Zhuang. So here I come to the conclusion. Designed to be a garden where nature appears predominant, the city not only came to act as a kind of displacement of religious authority in the Asian regime, whereby the constraining moral effects of the latter were translated into the context of the urban life, but also the city became the site of reconciliation of human well-being, associated with both spirituality and general utility. The site contributing to social harmony and maintaining religious sentiment. Chambers' sensational urbanism gave us a powerful and highly significant example of how the Burkean sublime, within frameworks of spirituality and well-being, shaped discourses on city and landscape planning in the 18th century. Thank you for your attention.